Ambassador Taylor, in your decades of military service and diplomatic service representing the United States around the world, have you ever seen another example of foreign aid conditioned on the personal or political interests of the President of the United States?
No, Mr. Goldman, I've not.
That's House Intelligence Committee attorney and good friend to the program, Dan Goldman, getting to the crux of the matter with the Ambassador William Taylor. Taylor, he's one of many people who had testified behind closed doors before today that there was a quid pro quo with Ukraine. But he's now the first person to say it on live television under oath. Now, in this segment, I'm going to speak with one of 17 Watergate prosecutors who penned a piece in the Washington Post saying Trump ought to be impeached. And joining us tonight is Nick Akerman, the former Watergate prosecutor and also former assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York. And Nick, one of the alumni of the SDNY doing the questioning, Dan Goldman. So to that end, I'm sure like all of us, you watch the proceedings. Do you think it moved the needle in the public consciousness in any way? I mean, you know, the format makes it tough. It's spread over 6 hours. People aren't doing cartwheels on there. But nonetheless, we did get some information we hadn't known before about that conversation that Ambassador Taylor described that an aide of his was privy to between Sondland and the president. But overall, how did you think at the end of the day you would score the hearings?
No, I would give it a high score. I really think this is precisely what the Democrats need to do to educate the public as to what happened. In many ways, this is like what happened in Watergate. This is why the public was up in arms, why the public was supporting impeachment at the end. It's because they understood what the facts were. I mean, this is really the third phase that we've seen the committee go through. The first were the behind closed door depositions. We got a little bit of information that made it into the press. Some of the opening statements that the witnesses brought in with them were published. Then we got the transcripts that gave us a little bit more feel of what was going on and what really happened. But actually seeing people testify in person, being cross-examined, being questioned by the committee makes a whole world of difference. And this is just the beginning. So to say anything monumental just based on today, I think the best we can say is they really had a good format. It really got the story out there so people could understand what Trump did and what happened.
You know, Nick, I think it's important to actually talk about what the stakes are. And I think that they were articulated at one point by Adam Schiff, but to me, the facts really aren't in question. I know there was certainly some on the right argued, but we know about the conversation that the president even released, albeit in its redacted form. We know from so many principals, the two that testified today and others that were involved, that they all saw this as aid was contingent on the Ukrainian president basically at least announcing an investigation into a political rival. So then we get to the basic question as to, okay, well, what's Congress's job? Aren't they supposed to be a check and a balance? Don't we have co-equal branches of government? And the argument from the president's attorney was in the last couple of weeks, hey, my guy can shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue, and as long as he's a sitting president, there's no exposure for him. Are we getting to the basic idea as to whether or not the founding fathers and how they envisioned this thing was supposed to work, which is a president can be held to account for his actions, and that's the job of the legislative branch. The House and the Senate have assigned roles. If it's argued by the Republicans on the Hill and certainly by the attorney that they don't have to obey subpoenas, they don't have to participate in the process, and by the way, no matter what you do, you can't do anything because he's the president, haven't we basically changed the whole framing of what the democracy is?
No, and I think that's the big danger here. I mean, the big danger is this goes to the Senate, Trump gets acquitted, and then he wins re-election. So, I mean, the stakes here are pretty high because if Trump were to win re-election, I mean, all the rules change. I mean, the idea that a president of the United States can't use public money that has been voted by Congress to be used for the defense of a country against the Russians, and that's okay to hold that back in order to get an investigation into your chief political rival, that is a pretty scary proposition. And to make that a normalize it as something that can be done, totally undercuts the basis of our democracy, that we have open and free elections, that public monies used for the public good, that presidents use their power for the public good, not to hold back White House visits unless you're going to conduct an investigation into my political opponent or some crazy debunked conspiracy theory that everybody knows is nonsense. The idea that Ukraine, not the Russians, hacked into the Democratic National Committee, even though Mueller wound up having a grand jury which found that there was probable cause to indict 10 Russian operatives, intelligence operatives, for breaking into the Democratic National Committee, and an indictment that goes on in detail describing precisely what each person did while sitting in their office in Moscow. I mean, the whole thing is preposterous, but it's scary.
You know, Andrew, who's sitting here with me, mentioned the corollary to Watergate in a different way, and that today, for people who are paying attention to this for the first time, it's like there were shirts and skins, Nick. The Democrats were going through the questioning, trying to find out the atmospheric surrounding what the two witnesses today felt was going on, and the fact basis as to what happened in terms of the timeline of events, and to give context from the Ukrainian perspective. Every Republican basically denounced the process, that nobody should have been in the room in the first place, that there was nothing to see here. You go back to Watergate, the Fred Thompsons, the James Bakers, they wanted to find stuff out. Should we feel comfortable that in 2019, if this gets to the Senate, we'll find Republicans who are going to be asking those questions? Is this just that this is one body and when it gets to the Senate, it'll be the second act to the play? Or should we be worried that there are no Thompsons or Bakers that you had when you were prosecuting the case that looked at it as country first, then party?
Well, I think it's going to be the public is going to be the ones that are really going to rule this. Is the public going to be up in arms? Are they going to understand the facts? Are they going to pay attention to the facts? And that's really the whole purpose of these hearings, is to educate the public. You really couldn't expect people to read that Mueller report. It's very dense. It's very legal. It's redacted. It is not an easy read. The depositions, some of them are 300 pages. Again, you couldn't really expect the public to read that. Our best hope here is to have these hearings being held, put in an organized way where the story comes out, which it did today. I mean, it was done with none of this 5-minute here, 5-minute there, back and forth with questions. The story came out, and that's the important thing. The story has to be told, and it has to be told by the witnesses. And I think if it is in the way it was done today, and it continues this way, the public will understand what's going on, and that's what's going to make the difference.
Nick, there was honestly a rule I didn't know existed, which is, let's say, and certainly the numbers would bear it out, it gets through the inquiry phase and the House votes it up to the Senate for the trial. I didn't know that there was an opportunity for the Senate Majority Leader to have an up or down vote as to whether or not they would take the case and do the trial, and a simple majority would be all that would be required. Today, John Cornyn said, we don't have the votes to stop that, even though there's 53 Republican seats. Translation, especially if you had a tie and you have Pence that could break it, at least 4 Republicans wouldn't vote to not hear the case, so that if it gets through the House, it is getting to the Senate for the trial. Does that tell you anything?
Well, I'm not sure what it tells us. It tells us that there are 20 senators up for re-election. Politically, there's a number of those people that would be hurt badly by the Senate Republicans simply refusing to try the case. I mean, I think it would put certain people like Collins from Maine, the Senator Corey from Colorado. There's a number of people that would find that totally politically impossible for them to deal with. So I think as a practical political matter, they've got to deal with it. Now, once they deal with it, somehow they've got to be able to justify to the public that on these facts, this is not an impeachable offense. I mean, it is hard to imagine facts that would more justify an impeachable offense than what we've learned here about holding back money that these very senators appropriated for the defense of Ukraine while Russia is conducting a real fighting war against Ukraine. They've taken over Crimea. And here's Ukraine not getting the weapons and the funding it needs because Donald Trump is more concerned about having an investigation into Joe Biden and having a debunked conspiracy theory about who hacked into the Democratic National Committee in 2016, whether it was Russia or Ukraine. So if you can't impeach a president for that and remove him from office, I think we're in pretty bad shape.
Finally, you're going to let Dan show up to the SDNY reunions. Did he do a good enough job today?
Oh, he was great. I thought he was terrific.
All right, I will pass that on when I see him. And Nick, thank you for your time tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
All right, everybody, when we come back, a top official in the Obama State Department will join us to talk Ukraine, impeachment, and how the president is playing politics with the State Department's diplomacy. This guy knows what it's like to be on foreign ground representing the U.S. He's going to tell us what's going behind the doors at the State Department.